Hello and welcome to Africa Decode. I am Babudang, bringing you this week's in-depth analysis of significant developments across the Horn of Africa region. This week, we are examining four interconnected stories that are shaping the political and humanitarian landscape. First, Ethiopia's escalating dispute with Eritrea over Red Sea access. Second, the intensifying Amhara conflict where government forces have sustained unprecedented casualties. Third, a controversial oil agreement between South Sudan and South Africa that raises questions about resources equity. And finally, the United States' third country deportation program that Burkina Faso has publicly rejected. These are not isolated incidents. Rather, they are part of a broader patterns affecting governance, regional stability, and millions of lives across the Horn of Africa. Let's begin with the most potentially destabilizing development, the growing tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea. This week, Ethiopia's Foreign Minister Gideon Timotheus sent a formal letter to United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, making serious allegations against Eritrea. According to the letter, Eritrea and hardline faction of the Tigray People's Liberation Front are funding, mobilizing, and directing armed groups in Ethiopia's Amhara region, specifically supporting Fano militias. Moreover, the letter goes further, stating that the hardliner faction of the TPLF and the Eritrean government are actively preparing to wage war against Ethiopia. As of now, Eritrea has not yet officially responded to these. Eritrea has not yet officially responded to these allegations. However, Eritrea's Information Minister Yemane Gebremeskel did issue a statement calling Ethiopian government rhetoric about the Red Sea too crass and pathetic to sell. Furthermore, he described the ruling party's focus on maritime access as bizarre and mind-boggling by all standards. To understand these accusations, we need to examine the broader context of Ethiopia's push for Red Sea access. Since October 2023, Ethiopia has been increasingly vocal about what it calls renewed access to the Red Sea. Specifically, this landlocked nation has argued that relinquishing control of ports when Eritrea gained independence in 1993 was, in the words of government officials, an error. Just this week, Ethiopian President Taye Asqe-Selassie addressed Parliament describing the Red Sea and River Nile as great water resources which are essential to our country's existence. Consequently, this rhetoric has escalated tensions with Eritrea, which gained independence following a United Nations supervised referendum in which 99.8% of voters chose independence. Eritrea has controlled its coastline, including vital Red Sea ports, since that time. Currently, Ethiopia routes approximately 95% of its trade through Djibouti, paying for port access as its standard for landlocked nation worldwide. Given these circumstances, the question facing regional observers is what evidence supports Ethiopia's claim of Eritrean involvement in the Amhara conflict. According to reports, Ethiopia's foreign ministry letter points to Fano operation in September, including an attempt to capture the town of Wollo in Amhara region. The letter allegedly claims that TPLF commanders and fighters participated directly in these operations. Nevertheless, TPLF faction leader Debretsion Gebremeskel has called these allegations fabricated stories and smear campaign. In his view, they are designed to divert attention from what he described as the federal government's failure to honor the 2022 Tigray Peace Agreement, which was signed in Pretoria. Notably, Ethiopian opposition figure Lidatu Ayalo, when asked directly about Eritrean and TPLF involvement during an interview with Zara Media, stated, "I do not have information about their involvement." Instead, he attributed Fano's military gains to what he called the group's growing military capability. At this point, the Ethiopian government has not released detailed evidence such as weapons tracking, financial transaction records, or communications intercepts that would typically accompany such serious allegations. Looking at this historical context, the stakes become even clearer. Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a devastating border war from 1998 to 2000 over the town of Badme, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties. Subsequently, after Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took office in 2018, he built what appeared to be a strong alliance with Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki, earning Abiy Ahmed the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. However, relations have deteriorated significantly since then, particularly around the Red Sea access issue. From a legal standpoint, international law provides clear frameworks for landlocked states to negotiate port access through commercial agreements and bilateral treaties. Indeed, 44 countries worldwide are landlocked, and they address maritime access through diplomatic and economic arrangements rather than territorial claims. In addition to these regional dynamics, observers are noting the timing of these escalating accusations. Ethiopia currently faces several significant domestic challenges. First, the Amhara conflict, which we will examine in detail shortly, has now lasted over 2 years despite initial government promises of a swift resolution. As a result, over 4 million students remain out of school due to conflict in the region. Second, implementation of the 2022 Tigray Peace Agreement remains incomplete, with various provisions yet to be fulfilled. Third, Ethiopia also facing upcoming elections, and nationalist rhetoric around territorial and resource issues often intensifies during electoral period across various political systems globally. For Africa Decode viewers, several factors warrant continued attention. First, any military mobilization along the Ethiopia-Eritrea border would signal a dangerous escalation with potential regional consequences. Second, the international community's response, whether from the African Union, IGAD, or the United Nations, will indicate how seriously these allegations are being taken. Third, the connection between these external accusations and Ethiopia's domestic political calendar deserves scrutiny. And finally, the fundamental question of how landlocked nations negotiate maritime access in the 21st century has implications far beyond this specific dispute. With that context established, let's turn now to the conflict that's at the center of Ethiopia's domestic challenges. Indeed, the situation in Amhara region, where recent military development have been particularly significant, provides crucial context for understanding the broader tensions we have just discussed. The conflict in Ethiopia's Amhara region has reached what appears to be a critical phase, with government forces sustaining substantial casualties in recent operations. According to statements from the Amhara Fano National Forces, their military command carried out attacks in Abru district of North Wollo that resulted in 86 government soldiers killed and over 45 wounded. Furthermore, this follows earlier reports from the Beklo-Manekia area, where sources indicate that over 470 government soldiers were killed and with more than 170 wounded. In response to this development, the International Committee of the Red Cross issued a statement this week describing the situation in the eastern part of Amhara deteriorated further at the end of September, when a sudden escalation of hostilities in the North Wollo zone led to large numbers of casualties, captured fighters, and other severe humanitarian consequences. Consequently, the ICRC deployed teams to Lalibela and Waldia for over 6 days in response to the humanitarian crisis. What makes these developments particularly noteworthy is the nature of the operations. Specifically, Fano forces described the Abru engagement as a conventional operation, marking an evolution from earlier guerrilla-style tactics and ambush attacks. Turning to the humanitarian dimension, this week brought unusual development in terms of humanitarian access and prisoner treatments. According to the ICRC, Fano forces handed over 16 seriously wounded government soldiers to the humanitarian organization across the front line. Subsequently, these soldiers were transported to Wollo town and transferred to government forces for medical treatment. And additionally, on October 9th, the ICRC staff also visited detainees held by Amhara Fano in North Wollo, assessing conditions and treatment. In total, 6 ICRC delegates visited remote locations where captured government soldiers are being held. Martin Thalmann, the leader of the ICRC team deployed to the area, stated, "Many people have been killed or wounded in North Wollo in recent days." Interestingly, the organization's report noted that in past instances, Fano forces have been hailed for their treatment of captured soldiers, with some reports indicating they have paid transportation costs for captured soldiers wishing to reunite with their families. On the other hand, the conflict has also generated serious allegations of violations by multiple parties. Fano forces have accused government forces of shelling a school after suffering military defeats. Moreover, they have also alleged that government forces massacred 12 civilians in central Gondar's Alpha Takusa district, claiming the attack occurred at places of worship where peoples or patients were taking holy water, healing baptism. In contrast, the Ethiopian Defense Force, for its part, has stated it has taken action on extremist forces in East Gojam zone of Amhara region. Meanwhile, reports indicate the government has been deploying additional reinforcement to North Wollo over the past several days following military losses in the area. At the same time, the government continues to allege that Eritrea and TPLF are involved in supporting Fano operations, allegations that Fano forces have dismissed as false. Beyond the immediate military situation, the conflict's impact extends far beyond battlefield casualties. According to available data, over 4 million students in Amhara region are currently out of school due to the ongoing violence and instability. To put that in perspective, the conflict began in August 2023 when the federal government moved to disarm Fano militias, who had previously fought alongside federal forces during the Tigray conflict. At that time, the government initially suggested the operation would be resolved quickly within approximately 2 weeks. Yet, here we are now in October 2025, more than 2 years later, and the conflict shows no sign of resolution. Indeed, the ICRC's assessment was notably stark. Quote unquote, "There does not seem to be an end in sight as military action does seem to fail to address the security situation, and there is no active negotiation process to end it." That final point, the absence of an active negotiation process, is particularly significant for understanding the conflict's trajectory. To better understand the current situation, we need to examine how this conflict emerged in the first place. The Amhara conflict arose from complex local grievances. Initially, Fano militias formed as community defense forces, and they played a significant role fighting alongside federal forces during the Tigray conflict from 2020 to 2022. However, tension arose when the federal government attempted to disarm these militias as part of post-Tigray conflict normalization. Many Amhara community members viewed this as leaving them vulnerable and, furthermore, as part of broader concerns about their region's treatment under Ethiopia's ethnic federalism system. So eventually, the situation escalated when the government declared a state of emergency in Amhara region in August 2023, deploying military forces to enforce disarmament. Rather than complying, Fano groups mobilized in resistance, and the conflict has intensified since that time. For Africa Decode viewers tracking this situation, several indicators warrant attention. First, the evolution of Fano tactics from guerrilla operation to conventional warfare suggests organizational development and potentially broader popular support that can sustain more complex military operations. Second, the government's continued deployment of reinforcements despite ongoing casualties raises questions about military strategy and resource allocation. Third, the absence of negotiation process, as noted by the ICRC, suggests this conflict may continue indefinitely without political intervention. And finally, the humanitarian impact, particularly the 4 million students out of school, represents a generation whose education and future prospects are being fundamentally disrupted. This brings us naturally to our next story because, interestingly, the theme of conflict, weak governance, and external actors pursuing their interests emerge in a very different context when we examine what's happening with South Sudan's oil sector. Let's turn now to that developing situation, which involves another dimension of regional dynamics and international partnerships. This week, South Africa's Deputy President Paul Mashatile concluded a 2-day working visit to South Sudan, meeting with President Salva Kiir and other senior government officials at the State House in Juba. According to Mashatile's departure statement, the visit sought to take stock of the state of implementation of the 2018 revitalized agreement on the resolution of conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, known as accuses. However, South Africa's engagement in South Sudan extends well beyond its role as a peace agreement guarantor. In fact, the country holds significant economic interest in South Sudan's oil sector, specifically in Block B2 exploration, also called the Nile Orange Energy Project. The project operates through a joint venture between the South African National Petroleum Company, formed in 2025 through the merger of the Strategic Fuel Fund, Petro SA, and IGAS, and South Sudan's state-owned Nile Petroleum Corporation, known as NILPET. Under the agreement structure, SANPC holds a 90% stake in the project while NILPET retains only 10%. To understand the magnitude of what we are discussing, Block B2, located in Jonglei State, is estimated to contain up to 3.5 billion barrels of untapped crude oil. Industry analysts rank it among Africa's largest frontier hydrocarbon basin. To put this figure in context, if oil averaged $70 per barrel, which is actually a modest estimate by current market standards, the total reserve value would approximately be $245 billion. Consequently, under the current ownership structure, that would translate to roughly $220.5 billion flowing to South Africa, with approximately $24.5 billion going to South Sudan. Historically, the project stems from a 2019 exploration and production sharing agreement initially signed between South Africa's Strategic Fuel Fund and NILPET. The agreement established a 6-year exploration phase focusing on geophysical surveys, seismic data acquisition, and exploratory drilling. As of March 2024, the Strategic Fuel Fund completed what's being described as South Sudan's largest ever aerial geophysical survey, covering 47,000 square kilometers of Block B2 to facilitate subsurface mapping. According to available information, an environmental impact assessment is expected to follow, with seismic surveys and initial drilling scheduled for late 2025 and full well drilling projected for 2026. To provide context for evaluating this agreement, it's worth examining typical structures in international oil exploration and production sharing agreements. Generally speaking, standard international oil agreements range from 50-50 split for partnership between relative equals to 60-40 or even 70-30 arrangement favoring the resource owning country. For comparison purpose, consider the following. Norway, a highly developed nation with strong institutions, retains approximately 78% of its offshore oil revenues through various mechanisms. Similarly, Saudi Arabia retains over 80% through its state company Aramco. Meanwhile, Iraq, despite post-conflict challenges, typically negotiates agreement giving it 65 to 75% of production value. Likewise, Angola, as a developing nation, generally secures 55 to 65% in typical agreements. In contrast, the 90 to 10% split in the South Sudan's South Africa agreements represent a significant deviation from this standard range, falling well outside typical international practices for resource-owning nations. What makes this situation particularly complex is South Africa's dual role in South Sudan. On one hand, South Africa serves as one of the three guarantors of the RR's peace agreement alongside Sudan and Uganda. Pretoria's engagement in South Sudan peace process operates largely through the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, or IGAD. Previously, South Africa appointed former Deputy President David Mabuza as a special envoy. On the other hand, South Africa simultaneously holds this substantial economic stake in South Sudan's oil sector, described as a $1 billion plus investment, making the country's stability and government cooperation directly relevant to South Africa's economic interests. As a result, this creates what governance experts call a conflict of interest situation, where one party's multiple roles may create competing incentives that doesn't necessarily align with the stated primary objective, in this case, facilitating genuine peace and democratic development in South Sudan. In addition to these governance questions, the Block B2 location raises significant environmental concern that will require careful monitoring. Specifically, the oil block encompasses most of Badingilo National Park, parts of the Sud Wetlands, Africa's largest wetland system, and the Shambe Nature Reserve. Moreover, it also overlaps with one of the world's largest terrestrial wildlife migrations, involving up to 5 million white-eared kobe and 400,000 tanged antelope, among other species moving between South Sudan and Ethiopia. When Daily Maverick raises this environmental concern in May, SunPC's executive head of communication, Jackie Mashapu, stated that due care is being taken to consider environmental footprints at different phases of our activities. The statement noted that Phase 1 focuses on data acquisition and seismic work, with a comprehensive environmental and social impact assessment to be conducted for subsequent phases. Generally, environmental advocates prefer impact assessment to occur before exploration activities begin, allowing findings to inform whether projects should proceed and under what conditions, rather than after investments have already been committed. So, these environmental considerations become part of the broader picture as we move to our final story for this week. Indeed, the theme of international agreements, state sovereignty, and questions about equity continue as we examine the United States deportation programs and Burkina Faso's response. Once again, we will see how external powers engage with African nations, though this time in a very different context. This week, Burkina Faso's Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré announced on national television that the country has refused what he termed as indecent proposal from the Trump administration. According to Minister Traoré, the United States asked whether Burkina Faso would accept non-citizens expelled by the United States, not just Burkinabe nationals, but individuals from other countries as well. Naturally, quote-unquote, this proposal, which we deem indecent at the time, is totally contrary to the value of dignity, which is part of the very essence of the vision of Captain Traoré the foreign minister stated, referring to the country's military ruler. Significantly, the announcement came just hours after the U.S. Embassy suspended most visa services for Burkina Faso residents, redirecting application to the U.S. Embassy in neighboring Togo. Notably, the embassy did not provide an official reason for the suspension. In response, Minister Traoré, citing a U.S. diplomatic note that accused Burkinabe nationals of not complying with visa usage rules, called the visa suspension a possible pressure tactic. He concluded by stating Burkina Faso is a land of dignity, not deportation. As of now, the U.S. Embassy in the country and the Department of Homeland Security have not yet responded to requests for comment on these developments. While Burkina Faso has refused participation, it's important to note that the United States has successfully established agreement with several African nations under what's being called a third country deportation program. According to available information, more than 40 deportees have been sent to Africa since July, following largely secretive agreement with at least 5 African nations. Currently, the countries known to be participating in the program include Eswatini, South Sudan, Rwanda, Ghana, and Uganda, though no deportation to Uganda have been publicly announced. The current status of deportees raises humanitarian concerns. Specifically, according to reports, 6 deportees remain detained in an unspecified facility in South Sudan, while Rwanda has not disclosed where it is holding 7 deportees. Meanwhile, in Ghana, the situation has led to legal action. 11 of the 14 deportees sent there last month have sued the Ghanaian government, describing what they characterize as terrible condition at a military camp on the outskirts of the capital, Accra. Furthermore, Human Rights Watch issued a report last month indicating that the Trump administration has offered financial incentives to African countries accepting deportees under this program. Specifically, the organization reported reviewing written agreements showing specific funding commitments. According to these documents, Eswatini will receive $5.1 million in funding designated to migration and border management. Meanwhile, Rwanda will receive $7.5 million. Consequently, these financial arrangements raise questions among international law and human rights experts about the voluntary nature of these agreements, particularly given the significant economic challenges facing many African nations. Indeed, the structure where wealthy nations provide financial compensation to economically struggling nations for accepting populations has historical precedents in international migration policy, though it remains controversial among human rights organizations. Looking at the bigger picture, the situation raises several questions relevant to African sovereignty and regional cooperation. First, regarding precedent. If this program expands, it could establish a pattern where economically powerful nations use financial incentives to address their migration policy challenges through arrangements with economically vulnerable nations. Second, concerning the humanitarian framework. International law and human rights convention provide specific protections for deportees, including provisions about conditions of detentions, legal representations, and treatment. Therefore, the use of military facilities and undisclosed detention location raise questions about compliance with these standards. Third is on transparency. The secretive nature of these agreements, combined with undisclosed detention locations and limited information about deportees' conditions, makes independent monitoring and accountability very, very difficult. And finally, regarding coordination, whether African Union member states will develop collective policies on such arrangements or whether individual nations will continue negotiating separately with external powers. For Africa Decode viewers, this represents another dimension of how external factors engage with African nations and how African nations navigate sovereignty economic needs, and international pressure. Which brings us to our concluding analysis of what this week's development tells us about the current state of Africa. As we have seen throughout this program, these seemingly separate stories are actually connected by common threads that reveal broader patterns worth understanding. As we examine these four distinct stories today, certain patterns emerge that are worth noting. First and foremost, we see question of sovereignty appearing in multiple contexts. Ethiopia's position on Eritrea's control of Red Sea ports, South Sudan's resource agreement with external partners, and African nations' response to third country deportation proposals. Secondly, we see the complexity of dual roles. South Africa serving as both peace guarantor and major economic stakeholder, the United States as both development partner and deportation program operator, and regional powers balancing multiple, sometimes contradictory interests. Third, we see the challenge of accountability from the absence of negotiation process in Amhara despite humanitarian crisis to questions about transparency in oil agreements and deportation detention conditions. And finally, throughout all of these stories, we see the human impact. 4 million students out of school in Amhara, captured soldiers being handed over for medical treatments by non-state actors, deportees in undisclosed facilities, and communities whose resources and future are being negotiated by others. These stories will undoubtedly continue to develop, and Africa Decode will continue tracking them closely. We encourage viewers to follow these situations, seek multiple sources, and think critically about the various narratives being presented by different actors. Next week, we will bring you updates on these ongoing situations, plus new development across the continent. For Africa Decode, I'm Babu Drang. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next week.